If by definition you're doing a good job in consulting, you are probably more myopic, more confined, more narrow in terms of your perspective of the outside world than you think.
Hey, welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman. Unleashed is produced by Umbrex, the first global community connecting top-tier independent management consultants with one another. If you are interested in connecting with other independent consultants to build relationships, share lessons learned, and explore ways to collaborate, email me at unleashed@umbrex.com. We just heard from today's guest, Spish Rurak, who has served as a career transition coach to several thousand management consultants as they left top-tier global management consulting firms. In this episode, Spish shares observations on how to best prepare to transition out of a big firm, and he shows how to manage a successful job search. If you'd like to connect with Spish, there's a link to his LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Hello, Spish. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Will. Pleasure to be here.
Spish, you have worked with hundreds, I think thousands of
That's right.
consultants that are leaving top-tier consulting firms. Tell us how you help them think about their next steps.
It's very straightforward, Will. Since we're talking about consultants, the entire act or the planning preparation for what I call a transition or what some people might call leaving or pursuing a career step outside of or beyond consulting can be organized like a project. And so there's essentially three elements. And so one of the points I make to the individual who's about to leave consulting is to think of it as a project. Organize it like a consulting project. That's the first point. The second point is that individuals choosing to leave consulting have got to figure or address a very simple question at the very outset, which is, do they wish to continue in consulting, although not in the model or the environment in which they're currently working, or do they want to change? Now, a change means leaving consulting. In most cases, it means entering the industrial sector or the corporate sector. But then they have to figure out whether it's going to be for-profit, not-for-profit. Is it going to be large, small? So the first thing we do is talk about what the individual's thoughts are. What are the plans? Some people, I'll give you the statistic. I've worked with about 3,000 consultants who've embarked on career changes, job changes, which were predicated on leaving consulting. You won't be surprised at these statistics given the sample size. 1/3 have absolutely no idea what they want to do. Another third have, to borrow from the jargon of consulting, 3 to 5 working hypotheses. So maybe I can do this, maybe I can go with the client, so they have to go back, they have to look at the world retrospectively. That's not always the best solution. But that's the second cohort, 1/3, are working on vague ideas, each of which is built on a different experience, draws on something they either liked, didn't like, did well, have aspirations for. And then the third are very focused. They, for example, may have worked for 10 years in telecoms, they've worked for 5 or 6 years in a consulting firm, and then they're going off and continuing their career. So they know exactly what to do. The reason I'm going into this statistic is that the first thing you have to do is figure out who you are, what do you want to do, why, what for. And given the statistical breakdown I just gave you, that's not an easy answer for about half the people. So one has to do a lot of thinking, talking, almost like therapy, trying to discuss with the individual, why are you leaving? Some people are leaving because they're told to leave. Others are leaving because they're happy, but not really doing well. Others are not doing well, but are happy. You have to disengage. You have to disaggregate that. The other thing is the personal situation. To be blunt about it, I'm dealing, especially in the consulting world, with a lot of individuals who literally can do just about anything they want to do. That means in some cases they can do the thing very easily, but in other cases, if they really have a passion and they want to do it, they'll figure it out. So the question is prioritization and preparation. Why do you want to do this? If the thing is going to take a very long time, then they have to be prepared for it. But if you want to join a client, that's one path. If you want to set up an ashram in Bangkok, you can probably do it. If you really then pursue the second of these two examples, then you've got to figure out why are you going to do it? How are you going to get to it? You can put together a business case. So many individuals have got to figure out, and this is, in fact, a fantastic opportunity for many people, because the act of leaving opens up an entire vista of opportunities, of things that the individual can do that he or she otherwise couldn't have done in the consulting paradigm. So it's a question, to answer your question, it's really, the first thing is figuring out who you are, why you want to do something, and if you settle on what it is you want to do, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 things, setting up the metrics and the structure in which you can prioritize and explore. Now, not everybody is ready to explore, but that's another thing we can go into later.
Spish, you mentioned preparation.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit, and then we'll get into the 3 phases of the actual project. So what are some things that consultants should start doing, T-2 years, T-1 year, T-6 months? If you're thinking that you might want to leave a big consulting firm, what are the things that you should start doing to prepare?
One of the most frequently asked questions with individuals who start what I call the transition process or leaving is the question, what's out there? So if by definition you're doing a good job in consulting, you are probably more myopic, more confined, more narrow in terms of your perspective of the outside world than you think. Exposure to clients, the diversity of tasks, practices, business lines that one gets exposed to in consulting is a little illusory. It's defined really by the consulting firm. So to answer your question, whether it's 2 years, 18 months, 12 months before, start talking to people outside of consulting and start looking at what are opportunities out there. Job boards, sending your CV or resume out to headhunting firms to so to speak, stoke the market, let headhunters call you, find out what's out there. Talk to former colleagues who have left consulting. Where have they gone? Do they enjoy it? How do they come to get to it? I'm not suggesting a full-scale structured exploration of the market, but there are, let's say, one can do this if one has the discipline, because time is always scarce, in a structured way, 1 to 2 hours a month, just to peek outside of the world in which you are so intensely absorbed and committed. That will help you when the time comes to leave. You will have at least some partial answers to what's out there. So that's one thing.
All right. So a lot of folks probably went to a graduate school, maybe business school, law school, medical school. So, spend at least 1 or 2 hours a month. And if you're really getting serious about it, maybe even an hour a week, reach out to some former classmate, someone who left the firm 2 years before you, and just check in with them, just see how they're doing and figure out, hear about their role. So.
And you can structure it in one of 2 ways. You can be very direct. If the individual is someone who's what I call friends and family, a trusted former colleague, you can say you'd like to talk to that individual about the job or the company or the sector because you're interested in eventually moving into it. Or you can come about it in an indirect way. You can also practice this, in fact, with some client executives. By definition, clients, in most cases, are members of the world into which you as the consultant and soon-to-be former consultant wish to enter. If you get to know them on a personal level, find out how they came to be where they are. Get to know people on an honest, personal level to understand them and the world that they inhabit, because that's the world you want to enter. That will largely, if consistently executed, it will largely minimize the quandary that everyone faces with what's out there.
Okay. So just kind of find out what's out there, reach out, have conversations. What are some other things people should be doing to prepare? Maybe kind of building skills, or other than relationships, would it be things just, like your profile, your visibility, trying to get known in a certain industry? You
touched on a very good phrase, visibility. Once again, most consulting firms, especially the prestigious ones, create a sort of illusory world in which exposure at the very highest levels to the most serious problems that they're helping solve or address distracts away from the bigger world. You're more likely in leaving a consulting firm to take a job with a company that you don't know anything about. So what you have to do is step outside of the channel, the track, the world practice, and get exposure to communities, to constituencies outside of the client base or the target client base. So what do I mean by that? Going into conferences, attending alumni, if you're a graduate school or business school, giving speeches. Most consulting firms will advocate and encourage individuals to do that, but I found that most individuals in consulting who are focused on advancing their career will usually look at steps they can take to maximize their exposure internally within the constituencies of the consulting firm or its client base, and not outside. So anything you can do to be seen outside of the immediately available path and platform in consulting will enable you to be seen by outsiders. Just a simple arithmetic calculation. If you go to a conference, let's say it's hosted by Financial Times or Bloomberg about the state of the industry or challenges to a particular function or industry, if you go there and you sit on a panel, white tablecloth panel discussion, your name will be on a list of attendees. Headhunters pick up those lists. You will meet individuals outside of consulting who represent other aspects, other approaches, perspectives to the same issues which you're dealing. That kind of exposure is what will get you calls, interest. So in addition to getting smart about what's out there, making sure that what's out there also sees you is a very important step. I find when I debrief the consultants who've completed their successful transitions out of whatever firm they've been working in, one of the most frequently encountered comments, retrospectively, what do they get, is that they've learned, wow, there's so much out there that I didn't know about. And even very successful partners who have had machines under them developing clients and developing revenues, recognize that their networks, the people who knew about them, was a very small number, very, very small number. And it's only when they actually start exploring the market that they discover how many other people there were that they should have known.
A lot of people in the universe. So what are some mistakes that people make when they embark on this process? You've seen 3,000, so you have a pretty good sense of what works and what doesn't.
First mistake they make is not to factor in that I would say in about 95% of the cases, the search process for the next career step or the next job is going to take you longer than you think it should. So admitting that this is a process, unless you know exactly what you want to do, or you want to join a company that knows about you already, or you want to join a client, or you want to start your own business, the act of finding a job in leaving a one other exception is joining another consulting firm. With those singular exceptions, starting your own company, joining a client, joining someone who already knows you, former colleague, or joining another consulting firm, you're always going to face an exploration process, and that takes time. Recognizing that any experience that you've had in joining the consulting firm in which you're working and you're leaving, that the recruiting process, the way in which you were treated as a candidate for that, is absolutely irrelevant to the way in which corporate industry is going to look at you. Meaning, it's going to take 3 to 4 or 5 rounds of interviews, each of which will be interspersed with a waiting period of 2 to 3 weeks. You're not the only game in town. You're going to be, your candidacy for a particular position may be proceeding with alacrity, and then suddenly it's suspended. There's so-called radio silence, because guess what? There are other candidates being interviewed for the same position. To state an obvious point, most consulting firms truly value talent, so that if you're one of 5 candidates and it's only one position in the office you're interviewing, if the other 4 are really good, they'll put you into that office, or if you can't, someone else is hired, they'll put you in another office. And the other problem is that when you've been recruited into a consulting firm, it's frankly speaking actually a very homogeneous market, right? When you're being recruited for a position outside of consulting, you will probably be one of only 2 consulting profiles that they're looking at, and they're looking at individuals who've already experienced completely different set of skills. So the decision-making process, the evaluation process around the job for which you're being interviewed can become very complex on the side of the employer. All of this translates into agonizingly longer for them to decide, longer for you to wait. So that's problem number 1, is conditioning a set of expectations and the timing. The other thing that I think you have to learn to accept at the very outset is that, again, with the exceptions I mentioned at the very outset, the amount of work that you have to put in, the time you spend, the number of employers that you're exploring, the number of candidacies is a larger set than you really think, that you're really prepared for. So the amount of work you put in, how long it takes to get a result, is going to be more than you want.
And when you say more than you want,
more than you expect.
Yeah, more than you expect.
Yeah.
What's sort of I'm sure there's a big range, but if we think sort of the 25th to the 75th percentile range of time for someone who's not doing just going to another consulting firm or starting their own business, right? For that kind of search where you're trying to become, vice president of XYZ somewhere, how long do those searches typically take?
I'll give you a couple of benchmarks. Before I started focusing on what I call transition counseling or outplacement, I had spent 26 years as a headhunter. Most conventionally defined retained executive searches take 5 to 7 months to complete. That's a very good starting point, I think, because that is what I would call a slightly artificial condition. It's the ideal. In this case, the employer is committed, knows exactly what job needs to be filled, and has invested, let's say, the fees for the headhunter. Most opportunities that consultants are examining are either ill-defined or not defined at all. There is perhaps a demand for talent, but it's not been distilled into the precise details that I've just described in the case of. So what you have to anticipate, I'll give you a couple of benchmarks from my own experience, my sample. If you're effectively a project manager, in other words, you're not just a consultant producing a work stream, but you're managing a group of consultants, then that search will take anywhere from 3 to 5 months to complete. If you are a junior partner developing business but don't have your own self-standing practice, that could take anywhere from 4 to 6 months. If you are a partner who already has a business, could take 5 to 7, and very senior partners can take as much as, believe it or not, 9 to 12 months to complete. Because, why? The position that the more senior you are as a consultant, the more money the company will have to pay to hire you. The number of opportunities that you will have available in a large company, the more senior you are as a consultant, is a lesser number. You're looking at that top of the pyramid as opposed to the bottom. And there will be a certain unconventionality. Those positions will presumably be held by individuals who've already, quote, been there and done it. They don't have a consulting profile. You'll have a huge gulf to overcome in terms of the perception among most employers that consultants are really bright, fast studies, highly intelligent, but they don't know how to lead people. And they don't have management or responsibility for large body count or P&L. So if you're going after that kind of job, it's going to take most employers much longer to figure out how they're going to recruit you, even though they want you. That's the problem.
You mentioned you can treat the search like a project with 3 elements. What are those 3 elements? Tell us a little bit about that.
Phase 1 is what I call Toolkit preparation. And let me just list off a number of things that comprise the tool set. So you need a resume. Concomitantly, you need a LinkedIn profile. For every 5 people that you ask about what's a good resume, you'll get 7 opinions. There are different ways of saying what's the right resume. Basically, I espouse a short resume. 1 page is better than 2 pages, and if you really have so much experience, then 2 pages is a lot better than 3. So you need a resume. You need a an appropriately constructed LinkedIn profile. More importantly, you need to explain yourself. You have to have a storyline. Why are you leaving consulting? Why are you leaving now? What are you looking for? The obverse of that. You have to be prepared to answer questions about compensation. Depending upon the degree of experience you've had before you entered consulting, many of the questions that I've just articulated about what's your storyline, why you're leaving, are not that easy to answer. And in most consulting cases, they're surrounded by what I call emotional complications. People are leaving, even if they're at the top of their form, they may be leaving with mixed emotions. I've worked with, a very successful senior partner at a company, at a firm, 23 years, built like a rugby player. And when we addressed the issue of let's rehearse, why are you leaving and why now? The individual broke down into tears. It was like a divorce. He was leaving an identity of 23 years, and he wasn't quite sure what the new world, what the new identity would be. So it's what I call exorcising the devils around the actual first issues or questions that you will face. The other thing, these can be handled, by the way, what I've just mentioned, the resume, LinkedIn profile, preparing for the inevitable first questions, in some cases can be tackled in half a day. In other cases, take up to 2 months to exercise. Example, I worked with a successful partner who, in addressing and preparing the why are you leaving, why now, wrote a 9-page memo. I'm sure he never did that for any of his clients, but it took almost 2 months of whittling that 9-page memo down to about 5 or 6 basic sentences. That was the devil that we had to exorcise. So purging the past. You can't do it entirely, but it has to be started right away because it's there. It's under-recognized. It exists with all of us because we're all very ambitious, driven, collectors of achievements. Let me get down to the last points of the toolkit. There are 2 things that really take more time than the half day or 2 months that I just described. You've got to know where you're going, however provisionally. So my advice to everyone is think through which companies you're interested in exploring. Now, as I said earlier in the sample of the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 breakdown, some individuals don't have an idea. So that takes a lot of time to figure out on what bases, what criteria am I going to come up with a tentative provisional set of companies I'm interested in. Other individuals can come up with 5 or 6 immediately. My advice is come up with 20 what I call beautiful companies. The definition of a beautiful company is good answers to 2 questions. First question, the easier of the 2, why do I want to work for them? Well, every employer will want to know why any candidate they're about to hire is interested in that company. Is it because his or her upward mobility is frustrated, not getting paid enough, an opportunity to drive through a project to fruition was denied, maybe a geographic relocation, maybe work-life balance, all sorts of things. There is a good answer to the why, am I interested in you, and there are some bad answers. And each company...
What are the bad answers?
Bad answers, work-life balance.
Okay.
Although occasionally what can be slipped in is, I don't want to travel as much. But work-life balance is an absolute no-no. Never talk about that. Because however supposedly understanding an employer is, they will always, and they'll understand why you're leaving a consulting firm where you work 120 hours a week. They're going to get into what I call the mensuration complex, which is, well, will you work 100 or will you come in on Saturday night? If we have a real project. So that's a bad answer. Also, bad answers are, I'd like to make more money. They want you to join for the mission, for the team, to do something. So those are, relatively speaking, easier questions to answer. It's important to recognize that answers to that question can differ from company to company. The more difficult of the 2 questions for selecting a so-called beautiful company is, why would they want to hire me? You see, the ugly secret in a successful job search is, frankly, that employers, with very few exceptions, don't really know why they want to hire you. There may be a job, it's described. It may be a specification, job description with 15 to 20 selection criteria. But what makes one candidate look better or beat the other 2 to 3 to 4 is going to be the individual who helps the employer visualize what the successful candidate is going to do. In other words, for every job, there will be 5 or 6 candidates. They're all going to be different, right? They will all have comparable skill sets, intellectual acuity, maybe relevant experience. How does an employer make a decision? This candidate is 10 years older. This candidate is $10,000 less expensive. Which one's going to get the job? The way in which you can really help an employer move on your candidacy is to start talking to the employer about what it is that you will do, what you need, how will it look if you join. So, and back to the question of why would they want to hire me? In some cases, an employer would want you because of some work you've done on mergers and acquisitions. Another part of your background may be more relevant to another employer because of what you've done on digitalization. So it's important to recognize, now I think the message should be clear, that and this is a complicating factor, but after all, consultants can manage complexity, is to determine that you will be a different solution for a different problem. A big fallacy of many job seekers is to memorize a so-called 30-second commercial and say, this is my skill set, and expect the market to respond accordingly. It won't, unless the market is defined as a rival consulting firm who will easily not care about anything and take you just because of what you've been doing yesterday. So you can see that coming up with the good answers to the second question, why would employer A as opposed to employer B want to hire me, will require, one, a lot of research, which is easily done if it's a publicly traded company, a little more research if it's a privately traded company. Access to research can be online, public, annual reports, analyst reports, but also talking to a lot of friends who may work or are consulting to it. My forcing device to most individuals who embark on this hit list of 20 companies is choose 20. Now, not everyone can do that. The range I've worked with is 3 and up to 40. And it's important to recognize that this is your first roadmap. I mean, you can't, you need to have an initial direction. You have to recognize that if you take 20 or you start with 12, within 30 days of exploring the market, some are going to fall out, others are going to come in. It's a living list, but it's also a governor in measuring how well you're doing in your own job search. If you start with 20 and you're down to only 6 after 2 months, that's a little risky. So my advice is keep it always at the 20 level. So that's the penultimate aspect of the toolkit. The final point is coming up with a channel strategy. There are essentially, in my experience, 3 roads or channels from job A to job B. I'll list them quickly. Headhunters, call them low cost, low yield. Job boards or advertisements, they can be online. There's advertised positions. And the 2 channels that I've just mentioned, headhunters and job boards, have a lot in common. But let me tell you, statistically, for most consultants and a lot of non-consulting profiles, those 2 channels will account from anywhere from 5 to 25% of the yield in a job search, which takes me to the final element of the toolkit preparation, which is coming up with a network list. Networking is talking to people, some of whom you know, many of whom you may not know, who will either tell you something about a company or a sector you're interested in or help you get introduced to it. Every one of us has a network. Not all of us like networking. We don't always think about it. And when we do, most of the time, we have a very, what I would call irrelevant or unrealistic idea about networking. My advice to anyone embarking on a search is to come up with 100 networking names. In my experience, every individual, whether it's in consulting or a corporate counterpart, can usually come up with 30 executives or colleagues, former colleagues, whom he or she knows that will help them advance their job search. Now, we all have huge networks. I mean, we may have, 7,000 links on LinkedIn. What I'm talking about is an individual who is either in a company that the transitioning consultant is interested in or near it, knows something about it. consulting to it, written about it, formally worked in it. Most individuals can come up with about 30. In my experience, it's risky to embark on a job search and play out the networking channel with 30 or less. In my experience, most people end up conducting a successful job search having spoken to about 70 to 80 individuals. So it's useful to get 100 because you might not get the right job. You will get offers, you'll get opportunities. But it's important to recognize that every job is imperfect. And at this point, you actually have, surprisingly enough, a lot of latitude. And I think the foundation to make a good decision. So you shouldn't be pressed by taking the first offer. Therefore, you will go through several offers. But that's again, talking about scale, talking about a lot of explorations, a lot of dialogues. So preparing a network list of, let's say 100, if you don't want, maybe start with 50, it can grow. And coming up with the hit list of 20 beautiful companies, whether it's 12 or 20, that comprises the toolkit. You need to start with that.
So question on that. That starts to be getting a pretty large number of names of companies and names of people to keep track of. One way would be to use a spreadsheet, Excel or something. Are there technology solutions now that you recommend that job seekers use, kind of like a CRM system to track when's the last time you touched this person? Do you need to follow up with them? All the companies, all the opportunities that you're pursuing across these different companies. I can imagine some kind of CRM type of tool might make sense. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
You're right, except I don't know about it.
Okay.
What I find, interestingly enough, is everyone with whom I've worked, because I've worked with 3,000 consultants, about 1,000 corporate counterpart executives, every one of them uses a spreadsheet. But I'm sure there's an app. I'm sure there's a CRM. And I'm sure many of the CRMs that many of these executives or consultants use internally within their own company for tracking clients or even projects lend themselves to this. But frankly speaking, an Excel spreadsheet is enough. What's important is to capture all of this and to maintain the discipline to keep everything updated. I will tell you, I've worked, surprisingly enough, there are a number of individuals at very senior levels in consulting, for example, partners, who will tell me when I get into this kind of conversation at the very beginning of the search that they hate spreadsheets, they do it on paper.
Okay.
But it doesn't have to be anything very sophisticated. On the other hand, you're absolutely right that if there were a structure format that was easily available and manageable through a smartphone, that's the way to go. But I don't know of one.
All right, cool. Well, for my own business, I use Pipedrive, and I can imagine if I were about to do a job search, that's probably what I would use to track both people that I've talked to as well as companies and specific job opportunities at those. But listeners, if if there's a better solution out there, I'd love to hear about it. Let me know, and I'll add it to the show notes if I get some recommendations.
And I would ask that you let me know then.
And I'll let Spish know.
Okay.
So we talked through only phase one. So now we've talked through the toolkit. So you've got the toolkit in place, and some of that you could probably start that in advance, preparing your resume and your LinkedIn profile.
Absolutely. That's a very important point. That is not the beginning of a job search. That is, the advantages of phase one are, one, it can be done completely confidentially. You don't have to go into the market at all, which is important because a lot of individuals are deliberating about whether they should leave the firm. So there's absolutely no risk of compromise. The second point is that you have complete control over the timing, whether you spend 6 months working on phase one or 6 hours. Where the real search starts is phase two.
So let's talk about that.
Right. So phase two, you take the sheet of 100 or 50 networking names and you write emails to them. And it's like any outreach in a marketing campaign. You can segment that by seniority, by sector. Example, you may be interested in looking at 3 different sectors, one of which is a not-for-profit, the other one may be in high tech, and the third one may be in traditional corporate conglomerates or industrials. I mean, the beauty is that your background as a consultant makes it entirely feasible and realistic that you could be a viable candidate in any one of those. So reaching out to different individuals, adjusting the message, both by virtue of the sector or the geography, but equally by seniority. Some individuals will be information givers. I'm sure there's a lot written about job search books and so on. You will go into the market and ask people for information. You want to find out what's it like to work. If it's not the right job or it's not the right company, do you know of another one in your space or in your sector? The other one is what I call door openers. Now there you have to change the message because you're essentially trying to persuade even someone who very well knows you and trusts you why it is that he or she should take some active step, sometimes maybe stepping out beyond their reach in order to do you a favor. You don't really want to ask people to do you a favor. You want them to look good when they do something good for you. So there's, again, a lot of preparation so you can make call it a value proposition statement that empowers the individual that you've reached out to make the introduction so that then you can get into the right person. And then there's a decision maker. Those individuals are very senior. You don't want to reach out to them early. And you want to be very focused and specific in terms of what it is you act as that individual. So there's a segmentation and an adjusting to the message. But the point is, you should blast it out into the market as quickly as possible. That is the start of a job search. Now, back to my earlier comments, not all of these people are going to respond early. Some of them may be the best intention and they may owe you favors. However, they've got crises and emergencies that they've got to handle. And within hours of receiving your email, they've received 5 others that take priority over you. So it's a question of adjusting your expectations and factoring in the very real and common probability that you're going to have to send a very polite reminder. A lot of individuals are not used to doing that.
What's kind of a good thumb rule on how long to wait before you send a follow-up note? Like, hey, just wanted to follow up.
2 weeks.
Oh, 2 weeks, really? That long? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'd say 2 weeks, and you write an email saying, look, I don't know whether you received this. It may have been buried in your inbox, or this could have been spammed out. So if you don't mind, I'm just retransmitting. Would love to spend a few minutes on the phone with you.
Okay. All right.
My advice is wait 2 weeks. If you haven't on the second attempt, 4 weeks, give it one last. If the individual has not responded after 3 reminders, then it's very likely that person's not going to respond at all. Although, to prove the rule, I've seen exceptions where somebody writes back 3 months afterwards and says, I've only had a chance to look at this, or this got buried. So it's important, as a side note, it's very important not to take the absence of a response personally. That's very important. Mm-hmm. There are some, I would call almost they're ubiquitous good explanations why people don't respond. Because it's cruel to you when you want them to. There's in fact a cruel inversion of priorities. That individual to whom you've just sent an email is for you very important. Your email received in his or her inbox is not as important. It's supplanted immediately by 5 or 10 other priorities that take precedence. So reminders, important every 2 weeks.
You recommend phone calls?
Yeah. In all cases, obviously, we live in a world in which more and more of our communications is centered in the online and text. And I believe that, especially since so much of this is surrounded by intangibles and incomplete information, that what you write in this outreach that we've been talking about is asking to get some time on the telephone.
Okay, so now we're in phase 2.
You can phrase it as just 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah. So now we're in phase 2. So you're sending out emails, and then, I'm sorry, what's the rest of phase 2 and what's the rest of phase?
So I mentioned earlier there are 2 other channels. So there is a lot of, call it tactics, that you can start implementing with respect to headhunters. Headhunters, vastly overestimated, much misunderstood channel, but with, as I suggested earlier, with limited results, but nonetheless valuable, if not in the immediate term, meaning for the current job search you're conducting, then as part of a longer term, what I call exposure strategy. So collecting the list of headhunters. I think in the United States there are, by last count, something like 15,000 search firms and probably 100,000 practitioners in that field. Everybody knows a few headhunters. The reality is that those whom you know are literally the snowflake on the iceberg. So maximizing your exposure to headhunters, collecting lists. Tactic that I recommend to everyone is an organic collection of headhunters. Once you start, back to the example of networking, if you reach out to 30 individuals and you're talking to them about jobs, abstracting away from the awkward situation where you do not wish to ask your employer about headhunters he or she may know, but if you're talking to former colleagues, alumni, you can always ask, hey, do you know any headhunters who deal in this space? And you'll be told, yeah, I know these 2 to 3. Then you send your resume to that headhunter and you say, Jack or Jill recommended me that I should reach out to you. So launching phase 2 is triggering an outreach to the headhunter community and then factoring in channel 2, which is job boards online. The seductive simplicity of that is occasionally misplaced. I mean, you can do searches for jobs through the job board channel, in an airport lounge. You can do it on the beach. It's more useful to most consultants as an indirect way of collecting intelligence about what's out there. The likelihood that you're the right fit for an advertised position is frankly very low. However, if you find that an employer is advertising for a position, then one, you may have discovered a company that you never thought about and you're interested in. You found that company through the job board. Or if the job is either too senior or too junior for you, that means there's possibly an unadvertised position in that company you can reach out to without responding to that job board application. So I advise a multi-path strategy. Each element is distinct, but they feed on each other and they help you appreciate each of the channels more as you push down them.
I'm a little bit surprised about the advice around headhunters. Mm-hmm. In my kind of limited exposure to that world, my understanding was that headhunters basically don't want to get inbound resumes, that they have a specific mandate, and they typically like to kind of go out and search the universe and find people in those roles at certain companies and try to find them, as opposed to kind of getting inbound resumes. Yeah. But I'm you know better than I do, so I'm hearing that I was a little bit mistaken. So what's the best way to interact with executive recruiters? My understanding is that they never want to talk to you unless you're relevant to an existing search they have. Should you just kind of upload your resume to their site or email it to them? Should you ever expect them to talk to you? Tell us a little bit about how to interact with headhunters.
Yeah, you've answered the question, actually. It's correct. There is no headhunter who thrives on expecting an inflow of resumes to his or her office. They have their own databases. They have their own networks. However, some offices of some of the bigger global firms receive up to 1,000 resumes a day. Not all of them are deleted. Some of them are stored and agonizingly acted on 3 years later, after you've succeeded in your job search. So the reality is that the yield on sending a resume, that's why I said it's only 5 to 10%, is abysmally low. The only reason I mention it is that it's low cost. If you find 100 headhunters and all you have to do is prepare a skeletally simple cover letter, append or attach your resume to it, reality is you may get 3 responses. But it will have cost you maybe 2 hours to do that, and you'll get 3 responses. So it's a question of recognizing that this is something that isn't managing your expectations, but basically getting more exposure in the marketplace. Where the real yield comes from headhunters is 2 to 3 years later, if you've when you have already credentialized yourself on the corporate side, and you will be a much more attractive candidate for them. The reality is, very few headhunters are interested in consulting resumes because consulting resumes almost by definition inappropriate for most corporate positions that they fill. The employer would retain them to fill it because they're looking for someone who's already been there and done it. A consultant is not going to be a good candidate for a controller. What they're going to looking is for someone who's a junior controller or a manager of budgets and planning. Nonetheless, if you have, as an example, sent your resume to 100 search firms when you've done your search when you're leaving consulting, and then you send that same set of 100 your resume after you've taken the next job, you'll probably be getting 5 to 10 calls from them after you've taken the new job. So it's a combination of very low expectations and results in the short term and an incremental investment in the longer term. There are two types of headhunters. I don't know whether it's worth explaining. I think it is actually, because to your point, not all of them want resumes. It's not entirely true. There are two types of headhunters. There's the so-called retained side, where, in a sense, I'm simplifying here, the search firm has been hired by the employer, in many cases paid literally upfront, independent of result, and is looking at a specifically defined position and literally functioning as the clearinghouse. They will consider anyone, whether that is someone from inside the employer's organization, from the outside, their own database, their own networks, or something that's come in over the so-called meaning you could have sent them the resume and they're looking, and it's exactly right. They've been paid. They have no ego. If it fits, if it solves the problem, they'll do it. The other type, and basically at this stage, I think retained search firms work for employers for positions that are compensated annually at $200,000 or more. Below that are so-called contingent recruiters. Contingent recruiters don't have an exclusive relationship. They don't function as clearinghouse. They're essentially effectively a distribution channel for you. If you send them your resume and they like it, and they deal with 5 to 10 employers who might be interested in it, it's important to recognize that contingent recruiter is going to take that resume without your knowledge. Sometimes they'll be courteous enough and professional enough to let you know to whom they're going to be sending it. But in most cases, they'll put a stamp, and I'm obviously exaggerating here for some dramatic effect. They'll put a stamp on it that says it belongs to me, and they'll send it to 5 companies. And if the company buys it, meaning they want to interview you and they hire you, then the search firm will be paid. And that leads occasionally to channel conflicts, meaning you may have been already talking to that employer. HR department received your resume. Offer time is coming, and then discover that HR says, as they're processing you, that they've already got you in the files. That will not, by the way, hurt your candidacy. It simply means that the poor contingent recruiter is going to have the employer knock their fee down a little more. But those recruiters, and obviously with the 200,000 threshold that I mentioned, because many consultants operate at levels in which they're going to be looking for jobs that pay in excess of that. But if you're a 1, 2, or 3 year consultant and you're being paid less than that, and then there are many headhunters who will pick that up and live with it. And there are many search firms, contingent ones, who thrive off the consulting marketplace and fill positions, again, at the lower, more junior levels, where the employers are interested in bringing in the analytical talent that a consulting resume suggests.
I'm curious to hear, you've been doing this for a while.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear about trends that you've seen over the last couple of years. Anything currently kind of picking up an interest among the consultants that are leaving firms? Do you see any trends?
Several conclusions or impressions. First, I'm amazed, especially in the last 3 to 4 years, at what jobs consultants are taking in companies that I've never heard about. So the disruptions in the market, it's not just high-tech startups in Silicon Valley or biomedical and Route 128. Almost every industrial sector, consumer packaged goods, even industrial, is having a lot of small companies. And consultants are actually being scooped up by them. So whereas in the past, if somebody were skilled in financial services, I would have expected, the top 10 household names, the usual suspects, so to speak. Now, what's available is the heady world and the large and very volatile, constantly changing fintech. And there are, call it consumer tech. There's a lot out there. So more and more consultants are going into small companies. Before this recognition on my part, meaning 3 to 4 years ago, I found that small companies had trouble recruiting consultants. It wasn't easy for a startup to say, I'm enamored of this kind of background. There's now enough in the marketplace where, and a lot, frankly, of the startup companies, and let's talk fintech, are defectors from large banks who have seen consultants in their ranks or themselves have been former consultants and are now starting companies. So as a percentage of the number of consultants, so the total number of consultants, the share of consultants who are joining very small companies is expanding, continues to expand. I'm amazed by that. The second point is the traditional landing pad of consultants in most corporate environments encompass the following titles: strategy, planning, business development, corporate development. In some cases, internal facsimiles or imitations of consulting, problem solving, brain trust, and so on, that drew on the analytical talent. Because consulting itself has changed over the last several, let's say within the last decade, and gone much more into implementation, many consultants are now moving into, call it transformation roles. And they may be managing a project office. So one consulting firm has not finished a enterprise-wide transformation. They need to complete it. So they'll hire consultants into a lot of CTOs, Chief Transformation Officer, not Technical Officer. And a lot of them are actually penetrating the world of private equity. Private equity has traditionally been a very difficult sector for most consultants to crack. I'm related to my earlier remark about joining small companies. I've also seen an increase in the number of consultants who are joining private equity firms. Several reasons for that. I think private equity is recognizing that they've just about done everything they can by hiring out of investment banks, and that some of their relationships and some of the problems they face in managing their portfolios, not acquiring the portfolios, but managing the portfolios, will be better served by having consultants on board. So they're not going to be hiring a consultant to be an analyst. They're not going to be hiring a consultant to be a deal maker. By definition, the skills do not reside in the experience that most consultants have for deal making. They exist in the analytics, but you can get by with a first-year post-MBA to solve that for the private equity firm. But I'm seeing more and more insertion of consultants at the side of a portfolio company president. Most classically, most often, the CEO of a portfolio and operating company has to be there, but doesn't have the entire perspective or the experience to transform the company. He or she will have a sidekick. It's going to be the consultant who's hired by the PE house. So a lot more penetration of private equity, a lot more adapting to the change. And it seems like almost every company I've run into in the last 18 months is transforming itself in one degree or another. Fewer, therefore, planning and strategy roles, more implementation, transformation. Now, these are not P&L. These are not running a cost or profit center. They are still using the skill set inherent in a consulting profile, which is traversing all of the different organizations, getting a corporate or enterprise-wide initiative in place. But it's the advantage, I think, for many consultants is if that is the first position they take when they join, their chances of moving into the operating line, which is the dream of most consultants when they leave consulting are much better than if they had been in a traditional strategy or planning role, which is further divorced from the operating line. So those are several trends. I think also another one is, I would say, mobility. I've seen in most of the geographies I operate in a readiness to take a job elsewhere. Now, it's complicated, spousal, dual career issues and so on, but nonetheless, I'm seeing people looking outside of the geography in which they've developed their career. A greater openness and recognition that it would be good for them to work somewhere else, physically, locationally.
Different country?
Different country. And but sometimes driven by the fact, and it's not just an indirect comment on, they call it the psychology of the consultant profile. It's driven by the globalization. The fact that I'm working right now with call it a senior, in McKinsey terms, an AP, who's European by background and interested in sustainability and environment, but many of the companies, and he's looking for a job in the United States, but many of the companies that he's interviewing with are in Europe, and they're trying to move into the United States. And he can have opportunities both in Europe as well as in the West Coast, as well as in the East Coast. So there's a spreading, a call it geography of companies, and not necessarily just big ones. Small companies are distributed.
Spish, we've mainly been talking about folks that are directly leaving a consulting firm. Any advice for consultants who have now spent 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years at a firm and like the role, but maybe they're thinking about, hey, I want to try something new in a year or 2. For someone in that role who has done consulting, is now an executive somewhere, but thinking about making a transition in a year or 2, anything different that person should be doing to build relationships outside the company or raise their visibility or any other recommendations you have for someone in that position?
Well, some of the points you just mentioned, if the individual still has time before the actual act of leaving, clearly maximizing your exposure on the outside. So without any seditious or treasonous behavior, for any given activity that you're doing for your current employer, I advise, see if you can, on that business trip, meet a former colleague. Go attend a conference. Go talk to some blogger who writes about your company or your industry. The ugly secret in not job searches, but career development, I find, is that any individual executive, and this holds true for a consultant or maybe, SVP of something or other in a large company, at any one moment, that person can visualize probably 1 to 4 different career steps in that company, right? You can maybe succeed your boss, or maybe if you complete this particular initiative or project, the internal customer might want to take you in and make you their number 2 in marketing or distribution. But it's a small single-digit number. Whereas outside of your current employer, and this is what some people, you can find 10 competitors and 10 potential entrants into that space, each of whom will have 3. So the under-recognized secret in the career development is that you have more opportunities outside of your current employer to advance your career than you do in. Now, human nature being what it is, you default into doing everything that's possible within the current employer, and for very good reason. The inner workings, the processes. It's finite, it's predictable, it's controllable. But the reality is, you can do better for yourself, probably outside. So back to your question, if you're going to be making a change, it's important to recognize that you should start doing what we've been talking about for most consultants, maximizing exposure outside, going through many of these issues. By the way, also thinking through what's your storyline. Why are you leaving? What are you looking for? If you're a former consultant and spent 3 years, let's say, first in planning and then moved into the operating line, how are you going to explain your interest in leaving? What are you looking for? It's also important to cobble together your storyline. What have you really done in that company? You see, consultants, when they go into the market, are defined essentially by the projects they've done for their consultants, okay, for their clients. And you can then take a look at if you've worked on 15 projects or whether you worked on 150, you can more or less segment that or organize it around what I would call 3 to 4 significant differentiators that define you. The same issue holds true, however, for the corporate world. So don't let yourself be just identified by the title. The great advantage in corporate life is that if you've joined and you're the vice president of strategy and then you become the vice president of marketing, it is a very simple, call it lingua franca, that you're a marketing executive, therefore you will be a fine candidate for marketing. That may not be the best thing for you. And in fact, what you've been doing in marketing may not fit in the next employer for marketing. So it's a question of stepping back and examining what it is you've been doing for those 2, 3, 4, 5 years and developing a story about what it is you know, what you're the go-to guy for or gal. And then putting together that toolkit. Also asking yourself, why are you making the change? We can all assume why people leave consulting, but why are you leaving? Is it that you're frustrated about mobility, the company is going south, it's not working out, you're not happy? And that's a very important point. It's fine not to be happy, but you've got to have a very legitimate explanation for why you're not happy and get away from the negative. And instead of talking about why you're frustrated or why you're blocked, is what it is you're looking for to take the next step, the positive thing. I'm looking at this company because I want to do certain things that I can't do here.
Any books or tools or other resources that you recommend to your clients?
There are 2 that come offhand. I recommend these all the time. So one is a book called titled Who, written by 2 individuals associated with the company GH Smart. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it depicts or presents a branded approach developed by this company about A-level recruiting. But it's a useful book for most individuals to understand the recruiting process. How do employers behave? What are they looking for? How do they organize a recruiting process? What do they derive from an interview? Where does the interview fit into the overall decision-making process? What can you do before and after the interview? So getting into the mind of the employer's recruiting criteria, system, and process. There's another book, I've forgotten the author at the moment, but it's entitled Hire with Your Head. That also is very good. It's almost a manual for the employer. So, if you're going to be trying to win an employer, get into the enemy camp for the moment and find out how it is that they work. So that's one. Another one is a book called The First 90 Days. It's also, it's written by, he's no longer at Harvard Business School. I think he's at IMD now in Switzerland. But his name is Michael Waters. And he's written 2 books. I've forgotten the title of the second. I recommend to everybody that they read The First 90 Days. It's a fantastic, simple read. Like most business school professors' books, it refers to a lot of what I call war stories. Hopefully they're all true, but they will enable you to figure out what to expect in most corporate environments. 70% of it will be evident. The beauty about it is that it presents it in a holistic, comprehensive structure organized by effort, initiative, and evidenced by lots and lots of stories.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's an easy read because like most of these books, the first 2 pages will tell you what's in the chapter. The last 2 pages will summarize it, and there are 3 checklists inside, so you can really, but invaluable. Everyone I've recommended that book to gets something out of it.
And that one is, and I just looked it up, The First 90 Days, Proven Strategies for Getting Up to Speed Faster and Smarter by Michael D. Watkins. And we'll include a link to that one in the show notes. And Who that you mentioned, I looked that one up too, by Jeff Smart. I guess he founded GH Smart.
Yeah.
And Randy Street. So we'll include those links
Straight and Smart.
in the show notes. Street Smarts, I guess.
Yeah.
So, Spish, this has been an incredibly valuable discussion. I can't thank you enough for being on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. Unleashed is sponsored by Umbrex, the world's first global community of top-tier independent management consultants. The mission of Umbrex is to create opportunities for independent management consultants to meet, share lessons learned, and collaborate. I'd love to get your feedback and hear any questions that you'd like to see us answer on this show. You can email me at unleashed@umbrex.com. That's UMBREX.com. If you found anything on the show helpful, it would be a real gift if you would let a friend know about the show and take a minute to leave a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. And if you subscribe, our show will get delivered to your device every Monday. Our audio engineer is Dave Nelson. Our theme song was composed by Gary Negbauer, and I'm your host, Will Bachman. Thanks for listening.